Well, welcome back. Back home, there's been a scathing critique of the Labor Party by someone who used to be right at the heart of it, the former Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner, in a series of essays published today, writes that Labor's become an electoral machine largely devoid of wider purpose. He goes on to say the unedifying gyrations on climate change and asylum seekers over the past 15 years hardly suggest a clear purpose. In New York, this was the Prime Minister's response.
Can be very clear about the government's purpose, and the government's purpose is to keep the economy strong, to make sure that not only today but tomorrow Australians have got the best of opportunities and we maximise our prosperity as our region changes, and then we find a way to share that is fair and meets the needs of the Australian people.
Lindsay Tanner was also a member of Kevin Rudd's inner circle, the so-called kitchen cabinet, and he announced he was quitting federal politics on the day that Kevin Rudd was rolled. He has described that leadership coup as such an extreme thing to do that those involved have found it necessary to enormously exaggerate the deficiencies in Kevin Rudd's leadership. Well, joining me now, our political panel, the recently promoted Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Jamie Briggs joins us from Adelaide. Congratulations and good morning.
Good morning, David.
And Ed Husic, a man who is deserving of promotion, the Labor MP, joins us from Sydney. Thanks for your time as well.
G'day.
We'll start with you, Ed Husic. First on Kevin Rudd. Were the attacks on him by your party this year, as Lindsay Tanner put it, extremely perverse and highly exaggerated?
Look, I said at the time I wasn't comfortable at all with that, because I'm not one to see us pull down our own. I thought that some of them were out of line then. I won't ever change my mind, but I think things have moved on, and we've got the job of governing before us.
But what did you make of Lindsay Tanner's essays? Was there any merit in anything he was saying there?
Look, I saw some. All I've seen really, David, is what's been in the media today. But I look forward to reading his essay, because Lindsay has been someone who's devoted quite a lot of thought about issues and direction of politics in Australia. There's some things I disagree with. Like, I mean, he was one of the toughest finance ministers around. You wouldn't be able to get much past him, and you need to be able to build cases for what you want to do. And his criticism that we went to the Productivity Commission on NDIS I thought was rough. But I think there is a conversation we do need to have about how sterile and how conditioned we are in terms of politics. As a new MP, I think more often than not we're conditioned not to speak on issues that we're concerned about. And I think that really does need to be addressed, because I think fundamentally there should be give in the system for, if politics is a contest of ideas, for ideas to be able to be expressed. But more often than not, like if Jamie says something, our side will, that's out of line from the opposition, our side will jump up. If I say something, their side jumps up, and we're poorer for it in terms of not prosecuting ideas.
So have you got any ideas for changing that style of politics at the moment, particularly in your party?
Well, look, to be honest, I'll always be allergic to that type of conditioning of just not persuading, but rather just sticking the one-liners of the day on a battering ram and just keep pushing and pushing and pushing until the message gets through. One of the other things I really never supported, and I've told Kevin this, and I take this view now, is this whole notion of caucus losing the ability to select the ministry. I think was a bad decision, and I'll always remain of the view that there should be a degree of caucus involvement in the selection process, because I think it allows for people to not feel like they can't speak up, that they are unable to prosecute ideas, and I think on both sides of the fence we are conditioned in that way.
Jamie Briggs, you've recently taken a position on the Coalition's front bench. I can't imagine you've got a problem with the way Tony Abbott selects his ministry.
Well, we haven't changed the way that, that it's always been the leader's prerogative in the Liberal Party who is selected. The Labor Party, of course, have had a different history, and Ed rightly identifies that history has been recently changed in 2007 or 2006, I think it was, when it was changed. But I think what you've seen from Lindsay Tanner is that the real issue for that affects the Australian people, which is that the government is rotten at its core. The simmering hatreds that are going on at the highest levels of this government really mean that the outcomes, the policy outcomes for Australians and Australian families is that the management of our economy, the management of our borders, the management, the job the government is meant to be doing, it is just not focused on because it is constantly engaged in this running battle about the leadership between Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. Kevin Rudd still desires the leadership. Lindsay Tanner's out there today throwing a few more grenades. We know Maxine McHugh is about to release a warts and all account of what Julia Gillard's involvement in the planning of the toppling of Kevin Rudd in the coming weeks, and that'll be read. And Bob Carr, I noticed, said that there are, you know, reams of papers being dedicated, or reams of books being dedicated to what's wrong with the Labor Party. Well, that might tell a story, maybe, Foreign Minister. Maybe it tells a story about that the Labor Party at the moment is rotten at its core. And to that extent, I agree with what Ed says. It needs to actually start to articulate what it really stands for, not just to have this ongoing battle which is really damaging Australia's prosperity.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily say it that way, Jamie, but at any rate, like, I understand that's the position you've taken. Yeah, my view is I think Jamie politics needs to be liberated from this process of conditioning. Sorry, like David.
Jamie Briggs, I want to just move on. There has been some display of what could be described as ill discipline on your side of the fence as well, with WA National Tony Crook saying that he'll cross the floor to support the government's attempts to fully deregulate the wheat market. Should he be towing the coalition's opposition to this, the opposition party line, or do you support his decision to cross the floor?
Well, look, ultimately, each party has a process of coming to positions on bills before the Parliament. Look, I agree with Ed that we need to have a battle of ideas, and Ed has been someone who's articulated different ideas, and in the past I've said, made comments about policy issues which aren't necessarily what the leadership of the day has wanted. But at some point, you've got to have a process to come up with an agreed position on pieces of legislation. Now, Tony Crook doesn't sit in the coalition party room, so it's not for me to make a judgment about what happens in the National Party room. That is for Warren Truss and Barnaby Joyce and the leadership of the National Party to work through. But obviously, Tony Crook has decided that he's got strong views on this issue, and he's articulating them today.
Ed Husic, what is the case for deregulating the wheat market? Why are we trying to do this?
Well, I think it's been a long-term process about liberating the way in which producers are able to choose the exporter that they want instead of going through AWB and the sort of recommendations made by the Productivity Commission to change the way we export wheat. We have had to go down this path, and so it's difficult. I mean, you'd want some consistency. I mean, I understand Deputy Leader Julie Bishop has previously voted in favour of what we've sought to do and is now championing a reversal of this position. I think it's an important reform that needs to be seen through, and hopefully we will get to the point where there is, taking on board what Jamie said, you've got your internal processes. You need to be able to obviously express your views. You might have different ones, but ultimately you take a final position, and that's what does need to occur.
And Jamie Briggs, on milk, the dairy industry, the China investment company is looking at particularly Tasmania's dairy industry. This has created a bit of this debate that we're seeing in the coalition party room. What do you make of that debate, and should the Chinese be allowed to freely invest in industries like dairy here in Australia?
Well, we've got a process, and we've put out a position paper or a discussion paper which we think will improve that process as far as that investment, welcoming foreign investment, and I'm on the record as being, supporting the economic reforms that occurred some 30 years ago and have resulted in such great prosperity for our country. And really, we don't want to see that being turned around. Now, ultimately, if there is a proposal to purchase The Foreign Investment Review Board will consider it if there's a single dollar of sovereign investment in it. If it's just a private transaction, there are obviously limits. And ultimately, it's up to the private owners of that land or that dairy to make the decision. And I saw yesterday reports on the front page of The Australian that dairy industry figures in Tasmania saying this would be very good for our industry. It'll mean we can expand, it mean we can take advantage of the huge growth in our region, and it will mean more jobs, more prosperity for Australians. From a government perspective, it means higher tax revenues, of course, because there's more economic activity. So in that sense, if it ticks the national interest box as assessed by the Foreign Investment Review Board, then it's ultimately got to be good for the country. And it's ultimately not a decision that the government takes, it's a decision that the private owner of that dairy takes to sell their property to whoever they think and whatever the best price they can get for it.
Just a couple of minutes left in the program. I want to talk about the budget and the government's attempts to bring it back to surplus. Yesterday, the Finance Minister Penny Wong announced $500 million in cuts to the public service to help the government get there, but there's another $44 billion or so that's needed in what is quite a dramatic turnaround from deficit to surplus. Ed Husic, can you guarantee that no jobs will be shed in order to achieve this surplus promise?
Well, it's great to reduce the complexity of getting a Commonwealth budget into surplus into one simple guarantee. What I can tell you is this. What we've said is there is an issue of contrast here. What we've tried to do is find ways to make government work smarter and better and be able to find efficiencies which still ensure that services are provided and then they're not slashed, that frontline services are protected. What we have, particularly in terms of state governments, and in my own state of New South Wales, it was left with a surplus, is now cutting expenditure, particularly in terms of education, $1.7 billion being cut out of that, simply to help fund they're hugely explosive northwest
Just a quick
rail
response from Jamie Briggs. We've just got 20 seconds. I just wanted a response there.
Well, if we know if they're quarantining public service cuts, what they will have to do is increase taxes for Australian families, because they've got to find a way to pay off their massive debt that they've built up, massive debt and deficit, through the wasteful expenditure that they've engaged in over the last 5 years.
Jamie Briggs, Ed Husic, thanks so much for your time on AM Agenda this morning. I'm David Lipson. The latest headlines coming up right after this break.